What's up, guys? This is Coach Jay coming at you. If you know who I am, Coach Jason from Jersey City, New Jersey, boxing coach, martial artist, trainer. So I'm outside just doing a little video. Just wanted to talk about the news I heard with Eddie Hearn. He mentioned that he wants to be the controller of boxing, similar to the way that Dana White is controlling MMA with his UFC promotion as the president. So that kind of, gave me some thoughts, because I know that's a topic and an idea that's kind of gone around quite a bit, is, comparing MMA and boxing, which isn't a fair comparison, to be quite honest. So if you hear any background noise, guys, I'm outside, so I'm just doing it. Might as well just do it. And so it's not really a fair comparison. Different sport altogether. Yes, they have similarities. They're combat sports, but what makes a sport different is its history, and we know boxing has a much longer history than MMA does, and a different history at that. Boxing is a little bit more wild west in terms of promoters and the way fighters interact with promoters and their own control of their careers, versus the way that UFC has kind of became sort of a monopoly in terms of the sport of MMA in comparison to the other promotions that exist in the world, like Bellator, ONE FC, and some of the regional players that exist, depending on where you live in the world. So his comments was he wants to be the one to control it. And I had mixed feelings about that. I don't think it's him necessarily that I would want to control it. That really wasn't what polarized me personally. It was more about the idea that there could be a model like the UFC that exists for boxing. And I think it's been tried, and I think it can exist because of a lot of factors, right? You have governing bodies that give out belts, right? That's very different than the promotion giving out its own belt. Like, for instance, UFC has their own belt, right? They give out their own belts, so that makes it a lot different. So the UFC champion is the champion of the UFC, and because the UFC is the biggest brand in MMA, they are considered kind of the gold standard in the sport of mixed martial arts. Whereas boxing has a governing body such as the WBC, the WBA, IBF, etc. And those organizations sanctions the sport and gives out the belts, but then you can have a promoter like, say, Top Rank and Matchroom that have their fighters fighting under their umbrella, right? So it's very different set of groundwork that the sport of boxing has versus MMA, especially with the brands. So I personally like the way the UFC has grown itself, because they kind of have an in-house system, right? They keep control of their fighters under their promotion, and their promoted fighters fight each other. So that when you put a show on, you are making your own promotion grow, right? So there is no competing with another promotion to make sure that you're sharing revenues, or there's difference in contracts. Like, that can still exist, obviously, but it's more of an internal thing rather than an external thing, because you, as the promoter, have a contract with both fighters, and so making matchups happens a lot easier than if it was two different brands, two different promotions trying to make a fight happen. So if boxing were to follow that model, how would they do that given the current state of boxing's model today? It would take a lot. It would take tearing down the entire system of controls. It would take maybe promotions ignoring the sanctioning bodies and devaluing the belts that they give out, because that's really what it comes down to, right? I think it's the traditions of the organizations like the WBA, WBC, IBF that are creating the value system that we place on the belts that these guys have. And so if you become a world champion with the WBC, you now have bargaining power because other fighters in your division want to have that belt also, right? So there is going to be some, competition between the guys who are not champions to try to rise up the ranks, grow their brands, and then fight for that belt. And the promoters along with them are going to do what they can to do, to create the right matchups either internally or externally with other promoters, and then try to, rise their fighter up through the ranks. So that has to change. That's the only way that there could be this model that would work like the UFC. Now, the only way for that to happen is you would have to have a massive promoter who would have to gobble up and pay a lot of fighters to fight under their umbrella. The difference is boxing is a very top-heavy sport in terms of the money. The money being paid to fighters in boxing, the top guys get most of the money, and the up-and-coming guys really don't get a lot of money, right? Versus the UFC or MMA model where, I could be wrong about this and correct me, right? Is the even distribution of money is a lot different, right? Especially in the UFC, which is probably a little bit more transparent about how they pay fighters. They have a tier system today that if you're a fighter of a certain tenure, you get X, Y, and Z. And if you're a champion level or experienced fighter or main eventer, you get this X, Y, and Z. And there's going to be differences, depends on pay-per-view, maybe your own individual brand and how you've grown your own standing with fans, right? So that's going to vary. But I think it's a little bit more spread out, and I think it's a lot more internal versus other promotions, versus boxing's promotions, I'm sorry. So in order for the boxing to even follow that, they would have to gobble up a ton of fighters under their umbrella and have their own kind of sort of tournament battle it out, and then bring rise up there and grow their fighters. Another thing is the UFC has kind of built itself off of TV, right? They had the Ultimate Fighter show back in the days on Spike. Then they moved to Fox, and then they now currently on ESPN. So that exposure that the UFC and MMA was getting in the past, say, decade, has kind of been the opposite for boxing in a way, right? Boxing has been getting less exposure in a way, like they were kind of a surge with, PBC on Fox and, stuff like that. But for the most part, that was probably a very, isolated short run. And again, it's controlled by a certain organization, with Al Heyman and his, crop of fighters. But I think he was on to something. And I think that's probably what needs to continue for boxing. Boxing needs to have more mainstream. And I think Top Rank is doing that now with ESPN. But you need to have more growth of the bottom of the fighter pool, right? The top heavy fighters are always going to have fans, the top of the sport, because they have the hardcore fans, and then the hardcore fans are going to create a buzz for the casual fan, and they're going to bring people along. So I'm a hardcore fan, and I'm probably going to bring about 5 or 10 people along when those big fights happen to watch these guys, when it's pay-per-view events and stuff like that. But you need to capture more casual fans, and the only way you can do that is if you have free TV, right? If you have a free medium where they can, learn about the sport, that maybe they just kind of lost interest in or didn't really care about at all, and bring up the bottom of the sport. If you watch a guy who's maybe young in his career and you can watch him free on TV, you might be more inclined to spend money on a pay-per-view, on a bigger fighter once you start to know and know about the sport. I think overall boxing in the in the North America, you know, particularly United States, has probably been kind of gone the way of a high-priced underground sport, if you get what I'm saying. You know, like the hardcore people are going to love the sport and they're going to spend money on the sport, but the casual fan barely knows who exists in it. And I think the model that the UFC had is really to grow the sport itself, and they use the underpaid fighters to do so, right? And they put them on TV and they have these, you know, prelim fights and things like that. But at the same time, yes, you might say, well, these fighters are getting paid, you know, being underpaid and they're being on TV. But at the same time, those same underpaid fighters who were on TV end up becoming main event fighters who get pay-per-view dollars at some point. And so it's really up to you to take advantage of it. And I think if boxing can do more of that, there could be, you know, a promotion that really takes the reins and makes that happen. And they have to make it a lucrative thing overall in the long run. I think the only alternative to that UFC model with boxing is there has to be this governing body that unifies the sport, right? Unifies the promotion and belt system model, and maybe throw away the sanctioning bodies like the WBC, WBA. Like maybe in America, right, for instance, there's a premier organization, kind of like how USA Boxing exists for the amateurs, that controls the governing systems of the promoters that exist under the sport. So maybe there's an umbrella of, you know, government boxing, XYZ, and then the promoters can fight under that one umbrella, and that one umbrella gives out the belts. They create the rankings, and they kind of do the checks and balances for the promoters to make sure that they're putting on fights that need to be made, right? And maybe they also handle the financial aspects of the contracts that exist for fighters. So maybe you build in a tier of fighters. Like if you have a 20 or less record, you can get a promotion contract that exists of this amount. So that you build in some sort of system where fighters can get paid fairly based on what's being brought in by the promoters. And then that can actually trickle back to the organizations that have sanctioning fees and things like that. So again, I'm just throwing something out there that could just be totally off base. You guys let me know. Just thinking out loud, and wanted to put this on a video so we could talk about it. So let me know what you think. You agree, disagree, any other ideas you think will work, and I'll catch you on the next one. Peace.